This is a production of Cornell University.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andy. You said everything I was going to say on the first slide. I'm so humbled to debut this project that's been in the minds of many for a while. And so this is a collaborative effort. I want to recognize the team. Harry, Michelle, Kate, and I are with ARS. Sieg and Frederic are at Michigan State, and Tim's in Berkeley. We're also looking for new members to the team, specifically the data manager position, which I will talk about more later. So the outline for today's presentation, just lay out the premise of the research, talk about some previous work that's been done, and then lay out Drive's objectives and approaches, finally closing with that facilitated discussion. So the premise of this, but also of many things these days, is climate change. We know that extreme weather events are increasing in frequency, and highly simplified agricultural systems are more at risk to suffer from these extreme weather events. And a wonderful case in point is some work that I did with my dissertation research. I interviewed dairy farmers out in Western New York. I asked them about their crop rotations, whether they've experienced extreme weather events, and how they recovered from them. And this one farmer told me that his banker once said, right here, all the farms in this area are hundreds of thousands of dollars behind because of those heavy rains, because they've suffered yield losses. So they got several inches of rain in one morning, and she was able to point out on the map the dollars and cents that have been lost. And so when I think about farming, a lot of it is debt financed. And so if you can survive some extreme weather events, maybe that takes a knock into your system as to whether you can survive the subsequent ones. So I think crop diversification is a key element towards redesigning our agricultural system, specifically crop rotations. And crop rotations increase the temporal and spatial variance of the landscape. So you have crops happening over time in a rotation. And then if you have different crops, those are being planted at different times, so you get that spatial diversification. And some of the benefits this brings about: different crops have different responses to stress and extreme events. Having crops in rotation break pest cycles, you're reducing those pathogen loads, you're changing up management so you won't have the same kind of weed pressure. And then it also distributes risk from, say, the economic or social systems where you can spread out risk and reduce your risk of market volatility. And finally, crop rotations are biophysically change the ag landscape in a way that might be mitigative, so regenerating soil health that would improve your chances for the next extreme weather event. And so now I want to turn this over to Tim, who's going to talk about some of the work that he's done. And Tim?
Thanks, Anne. And thanks so much for being here, everybody. It's really an honor to be presenting today with you. So I wanted to talk about one of the threads of the genesis of this project. There are a few different strands that have come together in the current work that we're doing, and this is one of them. And so, as many of us probably are, a few years ago, I was interested in us really quantifying the extent to which crop rotational diversity could mitigate risk from stressful conditions. And to do that, we really need to be looking at the past, at what's happened over a long term, encompassing a wide variety of types of stressors, and located across a wide diversity of soils and climate conditions. And so, inspired by some work on this at a few single areas from Amelie Gaden and others, I saw an opportunity to synthesize data from a number of long-term cropping systems experiments located across the US and Canada. And so started getting in touch with folks and just floating this idea, and I've got an amazing response from folks at 11 long-term experiments that were looking at crop rotational diversity. You see the names of folks over here that were associated with these experiments, probably a lot of familiar names. And these experiments were all corn-based cropping systems. That was one of the criteria. And they all examined a range of crop rotational diversity, from either a monoculture or a biculture, all the way up to, in some cases, 4 or 5 cash crops with a couple of cover crops in rotation. They varied across each location, depending on the climate conditions. The particular other crops and rotations could have been different. But they all had these commonalities, and they were spread across a wide precipitation gradient, from about 400 millimeters annual precipitation in Akron, Colorado, all the way to about 1,100 millimeters in Beltsville. And so, can you go on, Anne, to the next one? Great. And so what I asked for from everybody at each one was the corn yields in every rotation and every year of the experiment at the plot level. And these experiments varied in length from over 50 years to over 20 years, but all long-term experiments. And altogether, almost 350 site years of data, about 11,000 observations of corn yields. So a fairly large data set. And then, of course, I also was interested in kind of experimental metadata that was relevant, and to the extent possible, tried to get important things like planting and harvest dates. Although, as one challenge of doing this type of synthesis work is that certain types of data are a lot, some types of data are a lot easier to come by from these experiments, and others are much harder. Yields are fairly easy. Other types of data can be a lot harder to get. And so this is just a picture of kind of one of these representative experiments in Akron, looking at a number of different rotations over a long-term experiment, all phases present in all years in each of these experiments. So go ahead, Anne. So I went into this just wanting to assess the impact that more diverse rotations would have on specifically corn yields across varying degrees of stress. And just as a starting point, I wasn't focused on a particular type of stress, drought stress or too much precipitation, but just looking at kind of a generic metric of stress. And set out with just some very overly simplified hypotheses, admittedly, just to kind of get a sense of this. So, for instance, of course, as stress is increasing on the x-axis here, we expect yields to go down. And the question was, to what extent did corn yields in the diverse rotations differ in their response to stress relative to corn yields in simplified rotations? We could imagine lots of different scenarios here. One being, for instance, that actually at low levels of stress, that's where we see the benefits of rotation, but then those decline as stress increases. Or we could have another type of response where when in productive growing conditions, yields are similar, especially if there's sufficient inputs, but then we see the benefits of rotation appear when stress increases. And so I set out to test this with a few different methods. I'm just going to show you one of those here, and you can go on to the next slide, Anne. So we used some Bayesian multi-level models to test this, as well as the result that I'm showing here, which is a probability analysis, something that we borrowed from the way that insurance actually assesses risks, looking at the probability of crop failure, that is yields less than the 10th percentile, or the increased opportunity for so-called bumper crops or crop yields greater than the 90th percentile. And then comparing those probabilities between, in this graph, we're just showing the most simplified rotation at each site and the most complex rotation at each site. And so with the simple rotation, we have this in purple, and the complex rotation, we have this in green. And the sites are arranged from lowest to highest mean annual precipitation. And so without going into a tremendous amount of detail here, basically, if the green bars are shifted to the right relative to the purple bars, that means that we have an increased likelihood of bumper crops and a decreased likelihood of crop failure in the diversified rotations. And that's what we found at about 9 out of the 11 sites. We see at the dry site in Akron a different story, where actually the simple rotations outperform the more complex rotations. And I think this is largely a water story. But some really compelling kind of first look at this idea that rotational diversity can actually not only mitigate risk, but also increase opportunity when during productive growing conditions. So if you want to go on to the next slide, Anne. So in our first look at this, we didn't hone in on a particular type of stress. But I got my PhD in California during the 2011 to 2015 drought, and that has just made a huge impression on me in terms of the challenges that we face going forward, even in the irrigated systems we have out here, much less rain-fed systems that constitute most of the corn growing regions. So I wanted to hone in on drought as a particular type of important stress. And so we looked at, in each county of the US sites, we had 2 Canadian sites, but we looked at the crop insurance, the indemnity payments, and the cause of payment in each of the counties where these experiments were located over a 20-year period, and found that in most cases, drought was the most common reason for crop insurance payouts in the counties where these sites in the US were located. And so then the next step was to look at the 3 years in each of the sites that had the largest payouts for drought in these counties as a proxy for actual drought impacts in these areas, and then compared yields in the simplified versus diverse rotations. And you can go on to the next slide, Anne. And so this is just looking now at the percent difference in simple versus complex rotations during these 3 putative drought years. And what we see is that in 6 of the 9 US sites, we see significantly higher corn yields in the complex rotations versus the simplified rotations during these putative drought years. And so we have a lot more work to do to understand the mechanisms behind this, but this is one of the really, I think, motivations behind the work that we're doing now. If you want to go on, Anne. And so just some high-level conclusions from this. So greater crop rotational diversity reduced the impacts of stressful conditions on corn yields, but it also increased yields during more productive growing seasons. One thing that I didn't show here was that we looked at some of these experiments also were in a factorial design with nitrogen inputs. And so we could assess the extent to which just nitrogen was behind this crop rotational diversity effect. And when we looked at that, we found that when nitrogen inputs were high, the benefits of crop rotation were somewhat reduced, but certainly not eliminated. So nitrogen availability, I don't think, can entirely substitute at all for the positive effects of rotational diversity that we were seeing. And if you want to go on to the next one. And there's been, I think, a lot of interest in looking at long-term agricultural experiments in this sort of synthesis way, both from the standpoint of kind of yield resistance, resilience, stability. Couple of recent papers on this. The Sanford et al. Looked at one site in Wisconsin, and one of the sites that was included in our synthesis as well. This Marini et al. Came out last year and was looking at about 7 sites in Europe, found very similar conclusions to what we found. And others have looked at a broader suite of ecosystem services as well. And so that brings us to our efforts here to create a network of long-term data from these experiments. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Anne now to tell you more about where we're heading.
Thanks, Tim. So this work to initiate a network of long-term data, as Tim mentioned, that it has been in thinking about it for a while, but it really kicked off in this Corning Context workshop in Ames 2018, hosted by Matt Liebman and Marshall McDaniel. And the goal was to start to integrate a lot of data that had been collected from multiple research experiments and start thinking about things more at a cropping systems level in order to understand the impacts of diversity to agronomic performance, and particularly in the face of climate change, to yield stability. And so, as legend has it, from this conference, there were a group of scholars that all took a shuttle together back to the airport. And in this ride, they decided they were going to write a grant. And this is the grant that funds my postdoc today. So the DRIVES project works to network these long-term cropping systems projects. And it also funded 2 data manager positions, and the link is here on the website. And on the website, the link for the job is here on their presentation. So I encourage anybody, if they might know anybody, to send this presentation along. It is being recorded, so it will be available. The DRIVES objectives, we have 3 main objectives. And the first one, of course, is to build the database. And so we'll get into some details about that. There were 13 long-term sites that signed on as collaborators and committed to sharing their data in the grant proposal. And as Tim mentioned, they range across soil and weather variability. The criteria for being included in the DRIVES network is that the site needs to be in North America, have at least 3 full rotations of data, and be a corn-based rotation, so corn and monoculture, or 2 or more crops in rotation. So if this is you, or you might know anyone who fits this criteria, please pass this information along and reach out, because we're interested in adding more sites. And here's some detail about the sites. A lot of the LTAR sites are here. There's also the LTER, KBS in Michigan. They span several decades. And then just going into detail about one of the sites as an example, the Farming Systems Project located in Maryland was established in the mid-90s, and it has 2 conventional systems, corn, soybean, wheat rotation, and 3 organic systems with different rotations, ranging in the amount of cover crops, and one has a perennial forage component. And so across a lot of the sites, there is agronomic performance being measured, there is soil data that has been collected. Then of course, each of their sites have like the pet measurement that they like. And so this site has greenhouse gas emissions and also assesses economic performance. And so this is just an example of one of the sites that will be included. The database, we want to gather ecosystem services data from these long-term sites. So this includes provisioning services like crop yields or cover crop yields, supporting services such as the soil measurements of biodiversity, and then regulating services. So greenhouse gas emissions, indicator insect species for breaking those pest cycles, as we spoke about, and then water quality, so nitrate or erosion rates. And so this this is like this part of the graph. And then the more difficult aspect is collecting management data. So specific planting and harvesting dates, a lot of metadata attached with that, and pairing it with weather data. And so we've come up with 3 steps essentially of how we envision this data collection process to go. And you will see in the slide how crucial the data manager position is. And so in the first phase, we want to capture the low hanging fruits. So we'll have early simplified data management protocols, work on collecting crop yields that should be pretty standard for each of the sites. And so, building out from not just corn, but the other crop yields in rotation, cover crop biomass. In the second phase, we'll mature the data protocols and start automating the data acquisition and aggregation. And so the Drives data manager will work with a lot of scale related issues. For example, with soils, maybe one site has measured at the plot level, another site has measured at the field level for soils, or they've taken them at different depths. And then finally, for our taxpayers, the automation of data analysis and visualization. So we would like to develop a user-friendly interface that you can use to explore the database on your own, understanding the kind of relationships between variables that you're interested in. And so rubber meets the road. Here's how we're thinking about this. We have Tim's amazing data set that he's started, that he's put together, and then we want to build off of that initial structure, stand on the shoulders of giants, and then reach out to the individual sites as to collecting more data and develop this database on AgCross. What is AgCross, you might say? Well, this is the it's a diverse network of databases that facilitate the flow of information and increase cooperation among researchers participating in these networks. So really like the next generation of data management, where we're starting to really integrate a lot of data sets together. And so each of these spokes represents one of the networks that's hosted on AgCross, and they each have their own particular agenda. And Drives will have a spoke added as well, and we would be looking at things that are cropping system level, so looking at ag data at a cropping system level. So that's the database. And the second objective has 2 parts. The first part is assessing effect of yield on rotational, assessing the effect of the rotational complexity on yield stability and response to stress and extreme weather events. So we've talked about this already. And to say something heretical to a group of scientists, but we're at my kitchen table, more data alone will not get us to more complex crop rotations. And so it's important in this early phase, as we're building out this database, to start thinking, how can science be tractable with the current system that exists, and what are specific policies or vehicles that we would like to look at for instigating some change. So the second objective here is using findings from 2A and applying it to crop insurance risk assessments. And we're early days on this one. And to give it background, like a really broad background on federal crop insurance, after nutrition, crop insurance accounts is the second largest title in the Farm Bill. It's about $40 billion, about 10% of Farm Bill funding goes to crop insurance. And it's taxpayer funded, and it's a public-private system. So It's overseen and subsidized by the government, but it's carried out by private insurance companies. So it's overseen by an agency, the Risk Management Agency, that looks over this pool of money called the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. And then the RMA subsidizes federal crop insurance that is carried out by private companies. And the large majority of these insurance payouts go to high production agriculture. So a lot of smaller, a lot of larger farms here. And so we're proposing that the current US crop insurance as a lock-in mechanism for simplified rotation. Crop insurance as a general premise is intended to reduce producer risk, but the way that it's structured on a single crop often creates these perverse incentives that reward a lot of simplified cropping rotations and penalize more innovative production practices. And as an example, and Tim referenced this, this drought during 2012, this was a big moment for me too, to understand, like the ag landscape. And so this is an example of crop insurance payouts during that drought period. We can see these dark rectangles here. That's over $10 million of payouts in each county here. And it really makes me consider, like, what is the question? How do we account for risk in crop insurance? So right now, this is very broad, very early days. Risk is calculated much like car insurance. Here, it's based on a single season and it does not account for rotational effect. And if you aren't counting something, then it does not count. And so what we'd like to do with the data set that we're developing early on is start to look at how can we calculate risk more like life insurance and life annuities. So basing it off of the cropping system, which does account for the rotational effect. And then finally, the drives objective, the third objective, which really is quite an exciting one, is to look at the biophysical mechanisms that are driving the rotational effects. Of course, we can't quite do this until we get the data set up and running, but this is where the key questions are of, like, how do you design like a cropping system that is more resilient to drought, or that does improve water holding capacity? Where are these key points by looking at the biophysical mechanisms? And so I'm going to close out here and thank you all, and take any questions clarifying the presentation so far before handing it over to Sieg.
Yeah, any clarification questions? Yeah, Dominique, go ahead. Fran?
Hi, sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering.
Go ahead.
I was just wondering whether you've looked at all at the implications of scaling up these diversified rotations generally. That would presumably change a lot the nature of the food that's created overall in the food system, and there would have to be dietary changes associated with that as well. Is that a major barrier, or would there be health benefits from these the changing diets associated, or is it a showstopper that means that we can't really do it? How does that play out?
Wow, that's a big question, Tom. So if I understand it correctly, would diversifying crop rotations then instigate changes in diet and lifestyle, and like very, very big, larger societal questions?
Just to clarify, I meant it in the sense that you would then be growing a lot more of other crops and less corn, for example. That the actual food produced in the country as a whole would be a very different mix to what we have now.
So Anne, if I can come in, I just wrote a paper on this published in Frontiers that indeed, this has been raised as the Green Revolution. The rationale is we need to feed, 10 million people. And so does this produce enough calories is one of the main questions. But in fact, nutrition might be improved. There's some nice work out of India looking at minor crops and legumes, pulses coming in, replacing corn, which has been going up very fast in India, and then of course wheat and rice. Can you still feed people? Of course, this gets into bigger questions than we are initially looking at the farming systems level. There's some other initiatives, LTR and others are thinking about the whole landscape level, which is more what you're getting at. But I think these are very important questions because the market demand for the crops and the nutritional implications, we need to explore these along with these types of questions here in order to then inform policy. Because mostly it's been said, well, this just won't produce enough calories. So this is why we have to focus on corn and corn soybean. But that's debatable because that implies, the commodity chains are basically set up around using corn soybean products, and they could use other products. And also, you lose a lot of efficiency as soon as you go into livestock. And so it's a very big picture. And thanks for bringing that up, starting us off in that way. Is there any clarifying questions for Anne? We'll come back to you. Good point, Dominique.
Jeff has his hand up.
Yeah, maybe it's not clarifying. I was going to respond to the answer. In one way, commodity crops aren't largely eaten. That's simplest answer. But the other thing is that what we're seeing in Montana is, particularly in organic systems, we are, this is over 20 years of my life, almost 30 years of my life here in Montana, watching us integrate, for instance, pulses into the rotations with wheat, which is an amazing phenomenon, but it took 30 years. And yes, and those are more crops that we can eat, chickpeas and wonderful lentils and all of those things. So it can happen with those crops that you can eat, but as far as the Midwest, I don't see that same. And we have ancient grains and many of those things, and I don't see those happening in other regions of the country. Well, at least particularly in the Midwest.
Right. So I think we're getting off a little bit. I would like to get back to that at some point because I think it's really important because it's often said why we can't diversify is because of this calorie production. And there's starting to be some literature in this area, which Tim and I've just shared in the chat. But let's just go ahead and see what questions that you're thinking about at the field and farming system level, because I think I can say that if I can stretch this analogy, that we want to drive this in the right direction and we need your help to drive it. So we are still looking for collaborators at different levels. We're looking for further long-term trials. So can we just go over a little bit some of the discussion questions and then we'll come back to the big picture, which you guys are so good at. So please put in the chat and I can kind of summarize that, or just pipe up. Are there some research questions that excite you about this data set? And we've listed some of our draft hypotheses right there for your reference. We've seen some of the work that Tim Bowles and colleagues have started, buffering of stress, but I think there's both, in resilience theory, we know there's both pushes, stresses, but there's also extreme, 100-year floods, the extreme droughts in California. So buffering for extreme events, there's still very little literature on that. Might take some modeling, but might be explored here. What about other breaking pest cycles, reducing economic risk? Someone raised the issue of, are we going to look at economics? And regenerating soil health. There's so many questions on that.
Sieg, I'm just, this is Andy. I just wonder what your plan is to try to decompose these stressors. I mean, I assume that it's very important to understand sort of the mechanisms at play. And so do you have long-term weather data at these sites? And Tim, you mentioned earlier you had some information on planting dates that could give you some idea on phenology. But what's your plan for sort of parsing the story in terms of understanding the functional benefits of these diverse rotations vis-a-vis the threats that you're listing here?
Well, thanks for raising that, Andy. So what time horizons or spatial scales are you particularly, we're really curious what people are thinking. Yes, we're going to use weather data and some different statistical, including Bayesian approaches. And we also want to explore using AppSim, some modeling approaches. But we'd like to hear, like, what time horizons, spatial scales do you think would be particularly interesting for these questions?
Well, I mean, I think that just starting with the very provocative data that Tim put up, showing that in some years these where you've defined a stress condition, but that seems like a basket of a reflection of a basket of stressors based on a deviation from a long-term trend.
Right.
What's going on?
Right.
And of course, you know, then it opens up the discussion to consider the species in rotation. So thinking about whether or not this is really a reflection of soil regeneration and changes to the hydrologic cycle and the buffering that creates, or if this is really around pests and diseases. I mean, I guess this is a big challenge of working with historical data. We really don't know, but you might be able to define the residual if you look more carefully at weather events. I mean, I think you just starting with the sites themselves is the really great place to start, because you've already put so much into this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think you know, building in the weather data is going to be critical, and I think one advantage of taking this this cross-site approach too is that we'll have a lot of variability in both soil properties, hopefully changes in soil properties across rotations, information on pest and disease pressure potentially. And if we have variation and we have a lot of data points, yeah, we might be able to start sorting out some of these mechanisms, at least in pointing us in the right direction, if not testing them explicitly. And you know, there have been, I think coupled with this, and there's a couple of these, this work in progress with others, is things like imposing rainout shelters on these experiments and testing things directly. And I know there's some work on that, I believe, going on at KBS, and Amelie Gaden, I think, is on this call and has had some work in Elora, Ontario, doing this. So I think that we're going to see some interesting results coming out soon that do provide a little bit more information on mechanisms that are quite complementary to this historical synthesis that we're doing.
Thanks, Tim. Louis Longchamps, want to come in?
Yes. So I was wondering. I mean, some of the work here. Some of the objectives are to improve soil health, water quality. And like indicate reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and so improve the environmental health indicators. And you mentioned biodiversity. So we know that biodiversity is one of the, when we look at the planetary boundaries, I mean, this is the one that is the most off the chart and away from the safe space for humanity. So what has been done so far to measure biodiversity, and are there new metrics that you are thinking about for to quantify or to qualify the biodiversity at those locations?
So that's a really good question. And there are some of the sites have taken indicator species approaches, and some have more detailed soil biology type diversity questions. So some have used like ladybug beetles as indicator species or specific pollinators, and others are looking at decomposition, which may be related to biodiversity in the soil. So the regenerating soil health we want to decompose, because a number of projects have looked at corn yield in particular, but now we're interested in things like you know, some of these other, not just breaking pest cycles, but as you said, pollination or soil carbon accrual. And then, so both what are drivers of these, and then also how they impact then economics, for example, and other ecosystem services. So it's quite open. And thanks for reminding us, we really should have greenhouse gases. Not all the sites have that, but some do. And think more about the biodiversity in particular, which some interesting diversification meta-analysis have shown us that especially pollinators are something that we may want to think about. I'm really interested in what's enough diversity to support those. I think we've proven that you can support pollinators through crop diversity, but is enough for, you know, do we have to have a lot of diversity, or even just 2 crops has been shown for aphid predators, for example. Just having soybeans in the rotation can really alter markedly versus continuous corn. So is that, how much services do we get from that? So that might be one direction we could go. Other thoughts, questions? This is your time. Yeah, we definitely want to look at this, as Peter's put in the chat, monoculture and then corn, soybean, and then more complex rotations, because corn, soybean is, after all, what many farmers do rely upon. So what sort of sets of services can they get from that? Or having a small grain or another diverse crop in the rotation, how much extra benefits do we get from that? Or perenniality, as was raised earlier by Andy. So the more landscape level diversity, like prairie strips, is only at a few sites like Iowa, and now Michigan State's putting some of those in. So we will have to focus on mostly diversity in terms of temporal, although we may be able to get some at cover crop diversity for some spatial integration.
Just respond to Andy's question in the chat here about using satellite monitoring. Yeah, this is something that we've also been, not as part of this project, but as a related work, we've been using cropland data layer in my lab to map crop rotational diversity across 9 states. And so hope to be getting that out soon at the field scale. And then the tricky part is the yields and getting field scale yield data. And RMA, it's no longer available through RMA. And so the alternative is various types of remote sensing or remote sensing coupled with modeling. And there's a couple of good data sets out there that we're looking at to make those connections at that regional scale using remote sensing data. So yeah, that's a great point, Andy. That's something that is kind of being pursued in tandem here.
And this point raised by Michael Snow too about energy efficiency. Often we use economics as a way to compare apples and oranges, as you have with multiple crops. But energy efficiencies, I've done work at LTER at KBS with this, with Gelfand and Robertson. And this is where it really is startling, whether you're talking about conversion of energy, a system that's really for energy production, like fuel wood, or if it's for through alfalfa and then converted for animal use, or corn converted for animal, really the ultimate use really alters that markedly. But still, that's calories is another approach. Yeah, water balances. Thanks, Ray, for that. It's a good point. Maybe we should switch to looking at crop insurance, as there seems to be interest in that in the chat. And you have any specific questions about how crop insurance might be reimagined as more ecological insurance? We were thinking the first step would be this more whole rotation system. Jeff, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, no, I was going to comment on that. I spent about 18 years working on a very specific policy called whole farm revenue protection, which I talked on recently, and folks, that's why I got invited here, but appreciate that nice slide, the big drought and some of the other things. But it is a policy setup that specifically is available in every county and specifically incentivizes diversity in cropping and livestock systems. It's the only policy that does so. The other thing I would mention, which is actually in operation now, is what they call index or parametric insurance, which is they use it for pasture forage protection now. Essentially, it is working off of data and essentially in a grid on the earth. And if your grid shows through the data that you had a forage loss, you get paid. So it's a kind of an interesting way to change the whole system of crop insurance from the way it is. And I'll just finally add that the way it is right now is making it very difficult. Everything you've been proposing here, it would jeopardize everyone's crop insurance currently. And that would be a huge barrier to adoption of anything that you come up with this, unless you can reform that.
These are really good points. This is why I think we need really good data to inform evidence. Maybe Christina, can you share that with everyone, your point? Could you send as a direct message to me about diversification at the landscape level? Christina, do you want to share? Okay, you're pointing out the distribution of diversified systems drives the creation of how does it drive the creation of multifunctional landscapes? So can we think about specific services? I think we are, all these comments here are challenging us to think about implications for, Main Street, implications for a whole watershed. We are, because of how these field crop experimentation, long-term experiments have been set up, they are at the field and farm level. So even getting from field to farm and not just thinking corn, but the whole rotation is actually an important first step. But I think we really take on board these points that we need to then think bigger picture on this. And so is enough diversity for which services needs to be asked at both the farm and the watershed level? Very good point, Christina. Anyone else want to come in?
I think, Tim, you and I have mentioned, just briefly talking about, how can we use, would you be able to model diversification using the cropland database for more complex rotations? And then from that modeling, would you be able to say something at a landscape level? I think that's a really interesting question or premise, both.
Yeah, I think that is, I think that scaling, that extrapolation question is really important. And I do think it would be interesting for us to consider some simulations like that. And think of work from Megan Szczepanski and Steve Rosenzweig kind of doing this and intensified wheat rotations, kind of scaling up from field level data to the Great Plains, and in terms of implications for certain ecosystem services. So yeah, I think that's, to me, in terms of, I think our ultimate aims here, which I think is, I hope to get the attention of, maybe naively get the attention of policymakers at various levels, but I do think, as if we can scale up, at least with and be very open and honest about our uncertainty with that scaling, then that is maybe a more powerful scale to get people's attention on.
Yeah, certainly. The first step will be building building it out at the field level based on the data that we have, and then generating estimates at the landscape level, holding all else the same, because you change one aspect of the system, then some other thing changes, as Andy just referenced, like changing price, or because you probably have some spatial adoption happening, where if it's more adopted in one region, right? But if you were to just hold everything else constant to generate some estimates that might seem very tantalizing at a policy level, I think that seems promising to catch attention.
Yeah, and I think that will definitely build on. I mean, there's been a lot of work done on organic too. Organic and diversified agriculture tends to occur in areas in the landscape that are lower value and that are more diverse. The really high value tends to be more intensified. So I think that, as you just said, Anne, we're going to build on these. And to your point, Andy, about profitability. Yes, individual sites have, of course, done profitability analyses, just like the energy economics is an important way to consider across systems. But we're going to try and rebuild that out again. So through this cross-site type of approach. And so depending on the type of risks that we're considering, we may use subsets of the experiments. And we, again, want to encourage you to share with us the other sites that you know about that might fit in this analysis that we can use for testing, for further questions. So there's some points in, so what advantages come from scale diversification within field versus between fields in a defined region, from Kira? That's a really good question. Again, this is very much, the experiments have focused on field diversification. So either rotational diversification or cover crops within a field. So that's what we can initially test. So we can look to some extent at using some of these other types of models. There's a number of economic models that I can think of that we can go to ask these bigger questions about what happens when, when you have to take into account price in that case, I think, to try and understand how that might play out. But then that's why one of our first products or projects is going to particularly look at crop insurance, because that so much informs farmers' decision-making and in turn policy impacts on environment, I think. So Jeff, you're pointing out you have some diverse and complex organic larger scale system examples in Montana. Yeah, the famous lentil example indeed, I think is something we could take a look at.
Even more than lentils, there's people that have 8-year rotations with sometimes 20 different crops.
Wow.
I mean, these are existent farms that I've watched for many years.
Right.
And I think that resonates well with the California context. So we have 400 crops. We're in an irrigated landscape, and the site that is, our site at Russell Ranch is a little bit of odd in that list in many ways. So I was wondering, are there other sites where maize is irrigated? And how would we deal with that? How well the models can handle this kind of inputs, and how we're thinking around buffering extreme, the capacity of biodiversity to buffer extreme weather events in those irrigated systems.
Yeah, some of the North Dakota sites, or at least somewhere in the Great Plains, they do have some irrigated corn experiments there. So that's a good point, that we have to think about some systems are closer to the yield potential than others because water is taken care of. So I certainly would think that those wouldn't be as good an example to include for testing drought, obviously. I think it's a matter of, again, we're trying to take a lot of time at the beginning here to, particularly in this COVID time, right, to think about the questions, because there are many different ways we can do some data mining and see what is there, but we also really want to be very, think very thoughtfully about which types of questions might be of most interest that haven't been thought about, because in fact, there's quite a lot being done in this space right now, which is exciting.
And to build off of what Sieg just said, our team has spoken quite a bit about the timing aspect. So it's like, is the drought happening at planting time? And I'm not sure about, California, forage production, the Russell Ranch, but in terms of the Northeast, there are these key times where if you have an extreme event, it can really sink a system. And so part of that is getting the metadata, like when were these planting dates, when were these harvesting dates, so we can hypothesize about, narrowing this time range down to look at particular events in particular times where you might say, turn on the irrigation, and then, perhaps you would not have as drastic of an impact on crop production during the drought if you get the crop established. But the crux of it, I would say, just coming into this is like, planting dates are very easy to say, but might be like much harder to collect in terms of generating like this database and connecting the evidence to the actual management that's happened on those experiments.
Yeah, I think we'll do some deep dives on timing, and I also want to point out that we have a scale-up experiment that just completed at KBS, which we published in PNAS, and we found that, in fact, the organic, more complicated experiment, one of the challenges is that it's all about timing. And so what you can do on a plot level, which you might be able to achieve in some of these long-term experiments, you can't necessarily do at a farm level. So that's one of the challenging things about farmers taking on more diversified cropping, is not just equipment, but it's the knowledge and it's the timing to have time to do it at exactly the right time. It's not trivial. So these are some of the whole farm level aspects that will be more challenging to get at. But we appreciate this feedback. Is there any other like sort of deep dive type questions around regenerating soil health, for example, that people want to talk about? Because I think these sets are actually better for that type of question. Like, does perenniality or just diversity, is it enough to regenerate soil health? For which functions?
Sieg, how are you going to go back into these long-term trials and do some direct assessments? And if so, what are you going to measure?
No, this is data. I think maybe we weren't quite clear enough that we are using the historical data that we're building out this huge database. That's what this is basically, to now be able to do post hoc analyses to try and understand some of the findings and try and extrapolate at the whole farming system level rather than just corn response, which of course doesn't take into account that in a diverse experiment, diverse treatment, you have less corn, which may be the most productive, right? So it's really just the next incremental step. Although we hope that it'll raise all these other questions like implications for insurance, for example. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess from a research methodological perspective, I'm just curious how you're going to put the soil health lens into interpretation of the long-term trends. And if there's anything that could be done, just snapshot in time. I mean, all these experiments still exist to understand sort of how soil health or physical properties in particular have changed with time.
Well, fortunately, there is pretty good data on the soil health aspect. And there's even been the Soil Health Initiative and others have even been building out this with some of these same trials. So I think that just looking at soil carbon, what are drivers of that will be, I think, helpful as a first step, which of course relates to many other soil functions once you have soil carbon accrual. But it does often take, as a recent paper from LTR showed, it may take, 15 years before you are really able to detect changes in soil carbon with different treatments. But we do have those deep data sets. So.
Yeah, and I think that question is really, really spot on in terms of like, how do you do that when you're just looking at historical data? And I think we could have some creative approaches here in terms of, developing like some indices of yield stability or yield resistance to stress, and then predicting that with the change in soil, a given soil property between two rotations or something. I think that if what is again a real boon for this is that we have a lot of observations. And a lot of, and so, building a more complex model that incorporates a lot of interactions, some structural equation model or, something in that realm that can get at the interdependencies here, I think is likely going to be a way we'll have to go. But then it's still just clues, right? I mean, it's still correlative. But I think one thing that I keep coming back to is, the mechanism is important for us as biophysical scientists, as people who want to know what's going on. The ultimate outcome in terms of a risk reduction doesn't matter what the mechanism is in a lot of ways, if we can quantify that, and unless we're talking about using it in the mechanism in a predictive model, in which case that would be important. But yeah, so I think I think trying to keep that in mind, or that's something I try to keep in mind too, is when do we need to know, and when is it maybe not as important to be able to pin it down.
Well, I think we are up on the top of the hour, and that's a really great ending, Tim. So we really want to thank everyone, and we do have to have one shout out for Bayes. We are using Bayes regressions as well as structural equation modeling. So these are some of the collaborators that were at the first famous Matt and Marshall Corning context, and we appreciate all of them who will be knocking on their doors for data, and we appreciate all of you showing up today. Thanks so much, and please feel free to join us in this driving endeavor together to try and understand. So thanks for this wonderful discussion, this opportunity, really good questions you all asked us to start thinking big picture from the beginning. I think we'll circle around on that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Tim and Sieg. That was really wonderful. Deeply appreciate you coming in today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us. It was a lot of fun.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.